Karen calls cops on man for Harris-Walz shirt, then discovers he's the police chief. The morning at the small, local coffee shop was like any other. The usual crowd trickled in for their morning fixes: businessmen in suits, mothers with strollers, and students with their laptops out, all chatting softly over the hum of the espresso machine. There was a buzz in the air, the scent of fresh coffee beans filling the space, mingling with the soft clinks of ceramic cups and the occasional laughter from behind the counter. But then, as the door opened with a small jingle, the atmosphere shifted, just slightly. A man entered, wearing a Harris-Walz shirt, his face calm, eyes scanning the room as he made his way toward the counter. The design on his shirt was bold, striking, a bold endorsement that had become a lightning rod for political discourse over the past few years. He walked in with a quiet confidence, oblivious to the fact that his mere presence was about to cause a stir. Behind the counter, Karen, the manager of the coffee shop, watched him closely, her eyes narrowing as soon as she saw the shirt. A deep sigh escaped her lips as she leaned over to the barista, speaking in a tone that was low enough not to carry, but sharp with distaste. "Look at this," Karen muttered, her eyes flicking toward the man. "Another one of them." The barista, a young woman named Emma, looked at Karen with confusion in her eyes but didn't say anything. She could see the irritation in Karen's face, but Emma had learned long ago not to ask too many questions. She simply continued preparing drinks, hoping to stay out of whatever was brewing with her boss. The man, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension, reached the counter and gave Emma a warm smile. "Morning," he said pleasantly, his voice calm and steady. "Can I get a black coffee, please?" Emma gave him a polite smile in return, a bit taken aback by the lack of confrontation. She started to prepare his order, but Karen's voice cut through the quiet atmosphere. "Excuse me, sir," Karen said sharply, walking up to the counter. Her face was tight with barely contained annoyance. "You can't wear that here." The man blinked, his expression one of mild confusion as he turned to face her. "I'm sorry, what?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. Karen's eyes flicked down to his shirt again, a look of disdain crossing her face. "That shirt," she snapped. "It's not welcome here. We don't allow that kind of political statement in this establishment." The man's brow furrowed, the smile slipping from his face. "I don't think it's against any rules to wear a shirt," he said, his voice still polite but now tinged with uncertainty. "I'm just here for a coffee, not to start any trouble." Karen wasn't having it. She leaned in slightly, her posture rigid. "It's a statement, and it's divisive," she declared. "I can't have that kind of thing in my shop. You're going to need to leave." Emma, who had been watching the exchange unfold, felt a growing sense of discomfort. She glanced at the man, who was now clearly taken aback by the situation. He looked around, as though hoping someone would step in and defuse the tension, but the cafe was busy. Nobody was looking in their direction. "I'm just trying to get my coffee," the man said, his tone more frustrated now. "What's the problem?" Karen crossed her arms, her lips pursed tightly. "The problem is, you're making people uncomfortable. Your shirt is political. It's polarizing. It's not going to fly here." Emma shifted uneasily, the temperature in the room rising. She had seen Karen get into confrontations before, but this one felt different. The man wasn't shouting or being disruptive, he was simply trying to get his drink. Yet Karen's hostility seemed to grow with each passing second, as if she had already decided how the situation was going to end. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Karen added, her voice firm, as though this was a matter of utmost importance. "You're not welcome here with that shirt." The man's face went from confusion to disbelief. "You're asking me to leave because of my shirt?" he repeated, incredulity in his voice. "That's the reason?" Karen nodded, her eyes hardening. "That's right. I don't want to see it, and neither do the other customers." Her gaze flicked over to the few patrons who were watching the scene unfold, looking just as uncomfortable as the man now standing in front of her. "Look, I'm just here to have a coffee," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not trying to make anyone uncomfortable. I'm not bothering anyone." Karen's response was immediate and final. "You're bothering me," she shot back, her tone cold. "You need to leave." "No." Emma, standing behind the counter, was torn. She didn't know what to do. Karen was her boss, but the man hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't caused a scene. He was simply wearing a shirt that Karen didn't like. But it was clear now that the situation wasn't going to de-escalate on its own. The man seemed to realize that as well, a flash of frustration crossing his face. "All right, fine," he muttered, shaking his head as he turned to walk toward the door. Karen watched him go, her posture never relaxing, never softening. As soon as the door closed behind him, she turned back to Emma, a triumphant glint in her eye. "That's how you handle people like that," she said, as if explaining some great victory. "No tolerance for those kinds of people in my establishment." Emma didn't say anything, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a tension hanging in the air, an unspoken unease. The man had been polite, he hadn't caused any issues, and yet Karen had driven him out. There was no justification for it, no reason other than Karen's personal beliefs. But Emma kept her head down and continued to make the orders. She knew better than to argue with Karen, especially when she was in one of her moods. And with the man gone, she tried to shake off the discomfort. As Karen walked away from the counter, smugly satisfied with her actions, Emma couldn't help but wonder who exactly had just been kicked out. And why did the whole situation feel so off? The air in the coffee shop was thick with tension. As the door swung open, a small group of customers shifted uneasily in their seats, eyeing Karen and Emma with curiosity, but no one said a word. Emma stood behind the counter, trying to keep herself busy, though her thoughts kept drifting back to the scene that had just unfolded. Karen had always been vocal about her beliefs. She wasn't shy about making sure everyone knew where she stood on things, and sometimes she even wore her opinions as a badge of honor. Emma had seen it before. Karen had kicked out customers over far less than a political shirt, but this time felt different. The man, though he had been polite, had been treated like an intruder. The way Karen had spoken to him, the way she brushed aside his protests, it left a bitter taste in Emma's mouth. She couldn't understand why it had escalated to the point of kicking him out for wearing a shirt. But now, as the minutes passed, Emma couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was going to backfire in some way. She had a sense that the man wasn't just any random customer. The way he had carried himself, how calm and composed he had been despite Karen's hostility, it didn't match up with someone who would just walk away quietly. As Emma wiped down the counter, her eyes kept flicking to the door, watching for any sign of him coming back. He had left without a fuss, but she couldn't help but wonder if he would. Maybe he was going to complain. Maybe he talked to someone else. Emma had no idea, but something in her gut told her that this wasn't going to be the end of it. Karen, however, was in a completely different mindset. She was practically glowing with self-satisfaction, proud of how she had handled the situation. She stood near the espresso machine, chatting with one of the regulars about the disrespectful man who had tried to order coffee while wearing a shirt that made a political statement. "You see, Emma," Karen said, her voice loud enough for most of the cafe to hear, "some people just need to be put in their place. I'm not going to let them walk all over me or this shop just because they think they can flaunt their beliefs in public. I don't care who they are. No one walks into my place with a shirt like that and gets served." Emma nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She wasn't so sure this was something to be proud of. She glanced at the door again, then back at Karen, trying to maintain her professionalism. It didn't take long before the door jingled again, and this time the man from before walked back in. His presence was immediately felt. He had a certain air about him, a quiet confidence that commanded attention without being overbearing. As soon as he stepped inside, Emma froze, her heart skipping a beat. Karen didn't notice at first, still talking animatedly to the regular at the counter. But when the man walked up to the counter again, her smile faltered. "Can I speak with the manager?" he asked, his voice calm and measured, but there was an unmistakable authority in it now. Karen turned to face him, eyes narrowing as she recognized him. "What are you doing back here?" she snapped, the smugness in her tone quickly turning to annoyance. "I told you, we don't serve people like you here." The man didn't flinch. He remained composed, but Emma noticed the slight change in his posture, the way he held himself, the subtle shift that hinted he wasn't just some random guy off the street. "I just need to speak with the person in charge," he repeated, this time with a firmness that brooked no argument. Karen's brow furrowed. She glanced over at Emma, who was now caught in the middle, unsure how to respond. Emma could feel the tension mounting, but she wasn't about to get involved in this confrontation. She could only stand there, helplessly watching the exchange unfold. With a deep sigh, Karen finally waved a hand dismissively. "Fine, I'm the manager. What is it you want?" The man looked her in the eye, his expression suddenly cold. "I think you already know who I am." Karen's eyes narrowed further, and her lips curled into a sarcastic smile. "Oh, really? Are you some kind of big shot or something? Because from where I'm standing, You're just another rude customer who thinks they can push their political agenda in my shop." The man didn't flinch. "No, Karen, I'm not just any customer." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to hang in the air. "I'm the mayor of this town." The silence that followed was absolute. The hum of the espresso machine seemed distant now, like a faint echo in the background. Emma's eyes widened in shock, and Karen's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. For a moment, she was completely frozen, caught between disbelief and regret. "I'm sure you don't remember me," the mayor continued, his voice level, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "But I know this shop well. I've been here plenty of times before. I've donated to causes in this town, and I've helped this community grow." Karen swallowed hard. Her eyes darted around the room, as if searching for some way to save face, some way to undo the damage she had just done. But it was too late. The words had already been spoken. The mayor's identity hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud. "I should have expected this," the mayor said, his tone now laced with a quiet disappointment. "A public official like me, wearing a shirt in support of my party, and you treat me like I'm nothing." Karen's face flushed with embarrassment. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the counter. She knew she had crossed a line, and now it was too late to undo it. "I didn't know," she stammered, trying to recover, but the mayor wasn't interested in excuses. "You didn't know, but now you do," he said coldly. "You've made an assumption about me based on something as trivial as a shirt, and in doing so, you've embarrassed both yourself and your establishment." The words hit her like a slap in the face. The realization that she had wrongfully judged someone, that she had driven away someone who could have been a supporter, was a bitter pill to swallow. She had made her judgment without knowing who the man truly was. And now it was too late. The damage was done. The mayor's gaze never wavered as he spoke, his voice firm but carrying the weight of authority. "This is what happens when people let their personal biases cloud their judgment. It's a mistake you won't make again, I hope." Karen opened her mouth to apologize, but the mayor held up a hand, cutting her off. "I'm not here for apologies," he said. "I'm here to make sure that everyone in this town is treated with respect, regardless of their political views or the clothes they wear. I'm sure you'll learn from this mistake, but it's something you'll have to live with." With that, the mayor turned and walked out of the shop, leaving Karen standing there, her face burning with shame. Emma, still standing behind the counter, watched the mayor leave, a strange mix of emotions churning inside her. She didn't know how Karen would handle this, but she knew one thing for sure: things were never going to be the same. The coffee shop had returned to its usual hum, but something felt off. Karen couldn't shake the image of the man's face from her mind. The way he stood there, so composed, so sure of himself. He hadn't even raised his voice, hadn't acted out of anger. He'd simply stated who he was, and in doing so, it was as if he had turned the room upside down. Karen had always prided herself on being in control, on keeping things exactly the way she wanted them. She built this shop up from the ground, established a loyal customer base, and made sure that it was a space where she could enforce her own rules. Yet, now she felt a strange sense of vulnerability creeping over her. Her actions, her decision to eject that man, now seemed so rash. What had possessed her to treat someone like that? The moment he mentioned his role as the mayor, everything shifted. The words hung in the air, lingering like smoke. As she stood behind the counter, cleaning a cup she had already wiped down twice, Karen tried to focus, tried to push away the gnawing doubt in her mind. She needed to focus. She had a business to run after all. But Emma noticed the unease in Karen's movements, the way she kept glancing toward the door, as if waiting for the man to come back. The barista, Emma, had never seen her boss like this before. Karen usually walked into the shop with confidence, almost an air of superiority. She ruled this place with a firm hand, and customers knew better than to argue with her. But today was different. There was a crack in the armor, a crack that Emma could see growing wider with each passing second. The moment that man left, Karen seemed to have lost something. Or perhaps the truth had simply been exposed. "Are you okay, Karen?" Emma asked cautiously, watching as her boss continued to fidget, wiping the same counter again and again. She hadn't heard Karen's voice in a few minutes, and it was beginning to make her uncomfortable. She'd been used to the sharp, often critical comments, but now the silence was deafening. Karen snapped her head up, her eyes wide as if startled by the question. "I'm fine, Emma," she said quickly, a little too quickly. She forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Just thinking about the day, Emma nodded, but she didn't believe it. Karen had always been transparent about her views, but now it seemed like the weight of her actions was starting to sink in. Emma had seen people walk out before, of course, but not like this. There was something different about today, a shift in air, a subtle change in the power dynamics of the room. The mayor had made it clear that he wasn't one to be dismissed lightly, and Karen had just thrown him out without a second thought. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, and the sound of the door chiming when another customer walked in barely registered in Karen's ears. She was lost in her thoughts. The way the man had calmly declared his position, his stature, was something she wasn't used to. He hadn't shouted, hadn't tried to argue with her. He had simply made his point. The reality of the situation was beginning to settle in, and Karen felt an uncomfortable heat creep up her neck. "Did you hear about that guy?" One of the regulars asked Emma, pulling her attention away from Karen's distracted state. "He's the mayor, right? That guy in the Biden shirt?" Emma froze for a second, startled by the mention of the man again. She nodded slowly, glancing over at Karen. "Yeah, it's crazy, right?" The regular shrugged. "I mean, I don't really care what people wear, but I heard he's a pretty important guy." I wonder if Karen realizes who she just kicked out. Emma didn't answer. She just busied herself with taking the order. In truth, she wasn't sure if Karen knew the weight of what she'd done. Karen didn't strike her as someone who would back down, not when she was so confident in her own authority. Still, there was a part of Emma that wondered if Karen would regret the situation later, or if her pride would prevent her from acknowledging her mistake. The conversation in the coffee shop carried on. People filtered in and out, some oblivious to the exchange that had taken place, some whispering about it under their breath. But Karen remained unshaken on the outside, her hands still trembling slightly as she wiped down the counter. She didn't want to admit it, but she was unnerved. A mayor? It wasn't like she had been rude to him just because of his shirt. No, there had been something about him, his calm demeanor, the way he had spoken to her. It made her feel small. What if he decided to go public with this? What if he told the press about how she had thrown him out just for wearing a shirt? How would that look? The thought sent a ripple of panic through her. She couldn't have that. She was in control. This was her shop, her business. And if she had to convince herself over and over, she would. Another customer came up to the counter, snapping Karen out of her reverie. She smiled tightly, taking the order with the same practiced efficiency. Yet, in the back of her mind, she couldn't stop replaying the events. That man had been dignified, calm, and completely in control, while she had acted out of frustration and judgment. She hated the thought that she had been the one in the wrong. The door opened again, and this time Karen didn't look up immediately. She was still trying to calm her nerves, still trying to convince herself that everything was fine. But when the person approached the counter, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the figure walking in. But she didn't look up. She couldn't. There was an unspoken tension in the air now, a quiet anticipation that seemed to hang in the balance, and Karen knew it wouldn't be long before the truth hit her like a freight train. The day dragged on as Karen tried to carry on business as usual, but the unease remained. Each customer who entered felt like a reminder of the situation she had created. As more patrons came and went, the discomfort she was feeling only grew. She couldn't shake the image of the mayor standing there, looking unimpressed as she told him to leave. He had looked at her with a mixture of pity and calm authority. She felt like she had lost something: control, respect, maybe even some of her pride. She was sure of herself at first, thinking she could dismiss him as just another person with a political agenda, but the way he carried himself, how he didn't raise his voice or make a scene, left her shaken. Was he the type of man who could quietly expose her for her actions without even saying a word? Could this one moment lead to consequences she hadn't anticipated? The thought lingered in the back of her mind, gnawing at her. Karen's thoughts were interrupted by the bell above the door jingling. She looked up as a few more customers entered, their chatter filling the room, but it was a small group of women who seemed particularly curious. They looked to be in their mid-30s, laughing among themselves as they shuffled in. One of them caught Karen's eye as they approached the counter, and she immediately felt a sense of dread. "Excuse me," one of the women said as she stepped up to the counter, her voice light but somewhat amused. "Is that the same guy who was just here?" She gestured casually to the empty corner of the shop where the mayor had sat earlier. "You kicked him out, right? That was kind of a bold move." Karen's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she felt as though the room was closing in around her. She couldn't afford for this conversation to go public. She hadn't expected anyone to speak up about it, especially in front of a group of people. She wasn't used to being questioned like this, especially not about something she had done in her own establishment. "That wasn't your concern," Karen replied quickly, her tone sharp and defensive. "You don't need to worry about what happens here." The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Karen's response. "Well, it seemed kind of rude, don't you think?" she continued. "I mean, I get it. You might not agree with his shirt or whatever, but—" "I said you don't need to worry about it," Karen cut her off, her voice getting louder now. She felt her anxiety bubbling over into frustration. The group of women exchanged glances, and she could see that they were starting to grow uncomfortable. "I just think it's weird," another woman chimed in. "I mean, what if he's some important person? That kind of thing could get out and look bad for your shop." Karen's face flushed. She could feel her grip on the counter tightening, her nails digging into the wood. She had no idea how to respond. This wasn't just some random encounter anymore. The whole situation was escalating beyond her control. It was as if the walls were closing in on her, and she couldn't breathe. Why did people have to make a big deal out of it? "I'm running a business here," she snapped, trying to regain some control. "I'm the manager, and I make the rules. If you don't like it, you're free to leave." The women fell silent, exchanging another look. The tension in the room had shifted, and Emma, who had been quietly listening from the back, could sense it. She didn't know what had happened between Karen and the man, but it seemed like Karen was digging herself deeper into a hole with every word she spoke. She wanted to say something to defend the mayor or just speak up, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. It wasn't her place. The women didn't leave, though. They quietly paid for their drinks and found seats, but the air had shifted. It was as if they were all aware of something that Karen wasn't willing to face. Emma watched from the counter, her stomach in knots. Karen's confidence was starting to crack, and it was becoming clear that there was more going on here than anyone was willing to admit. Karen stood there for a moment, staring at the women who had just paid for their drinks, suddenly feeling exposed. She wanted to say something else to make herself clear, but she couldn't find the words. She wasn't used to feeling vulnerable, especially in her own shop. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She was the manager. She was supposed to be in control. Yet here she was, struggling to keep everything together. A few more customers filtered in, their voices blending into the background, but Karen's focus remained on the group of women who hadn't let the situation slide. Their presence, their subtle judgment, only intensified her discomfort. The sound of the door opening again drew her attention, and she looked up to see the familiar figure of a man entering the coffee shop. He was wearing a Harris-Walz shirt. At first, Karen didn't recognize him. She thought it was just another customer, and she braced herself for another confrontation. But as the man walked closer, her stomach dropped. Something about him looked familiar. He came up to the counter, his face neutral but undeniably calm. Emma turned to him with a polite smile, but Karen's heart was racing in her chest. Could it be? Was this the same guy from before? Before Karen could even speak, the man looked at her and gave a small, knowing smile. "You kicked me out earlier," he said quietly. "I don't know if you remember." Karen's face drained of color, and her heart skipped a beat. She recognized him now. He was the man who had come in earlier, the one who had been wearing the shirt she didn't like. But now something felt different. The calmness in his demeanor, the way he carried himself, made her feel even more uneasy. I thought you were just some random guy," Karen stammered, her voice shaky now, the words tumbling out in a way she hadn't intended. "I didn't know you were someone important." He nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm sure you didn't. But it's not about who I am, Karen. It's about how you treated me." The silence in the shop was deafening, and Karen felt the weight of his words pressed down on her. Her throat felt tight, and she couldn't find the right thing to say. The weight of the situation was becoming unbearable for Karen. She had just been confronted again by the man she had kicked out earlier, and the reality of her actions was starting to settle in. She had no idea who he was when she dismissed him. Now, facing him a second time, the calmness in his demeanor was unnerving, a stark contrast to her own rising anxiety. The man didn't look angry, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he stood there, watching her with the same serene expression, as if he were a mirror reflecting her own discomfort. His presence, so quiet and unassuming, felt like an invisible pressure on her chest. Karen wanted to speak, to make some sort of defense, but the words caught in her throat. She knew she had made a mistake, a big one, but she couldn't bring herself to admit it yet. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet seemed to stretch out for an eternity. Karen's hands gripped the counter, her knuckles white. She looked around, as if hoping for some sign that this wasn't happening. But the faces of the customers, some of whom had been witness to the first confrontation, all stared back at her, their gazes heavy with expectation. They were watching, waiting. And that made the situation even worse. The man didn't seem to mind the silence. He merely stood there, his posture relaxed but full of quiet authority. He wasn't rushing her, wasn't pushing her to say something she didn't want to say. It was as though he knew the words had to come from her. She had to come to terms with her own actions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "Karen," he said calmly, "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to help you understand something." Her gaze flickered up to meet his, and she saw a hint of pity in his eyes. It wasn't the pity of someone who felt superior, but the pity of someone who had seen this before. Someone who had been in her shoes, perhaps. She didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it made her feel even smaller. "What do you mean? Help me understand," Karen asked, her voice rougher than she intended. She hated the way it sounded, but there was nothing she could do to change it. The words were slipping out of her control, just like everything else. "You treated me like I was an outsider," he explained, his voice still calm but firm. "You made assumptions about me based on my shirt. But you don't know me, Karen. You don't know who I am, or what I stand for. All you saw was a man with a political statement on his shirt, and you made an immediate judgment." Karen felt a rush of heat flood her face. She knew what he was saying was true. She had judged him the moment she saw the shirt. She hadn't taken a moment to consider anything else. Not his demeanor, not his polite tone, nothing. She had acted out of bias, out of her own beliefs, and now she was facing the consequences. The silence stretched again, and Karen tried to steady her breath. She wanted to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? "I'm sorry" didn't feel like enough. It felt too small, too insignificant to make up for what she had done. "I don't know what you want me to say," she finally managed, her voice quieter now. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to," he repeated, nodding slowly. "That's the thing, Karen. It's not about intent. It's about impact. And what you did, whether you meant it or not, was wrong. People don't deserve to be treated like that because of their political views or the clothes they wear. No one should have to feel that kind of hostility." Karen bit her lip, trying to suppress the frustration building inside her. He was right, but she didn't want to admit it. Not yet. Not when her pride was still too bruised, when her authority was slipping away. "Look, I'm just trying to keep my business running," Karen said defensively, her voice rising again. "I don't need people like him coming in here and causing trouble." But the man shook his head, his expression unchanged. "You're not keeping your business running by excluding people. You're not making your cafe better by judging people based on their beliefs. If anything, you're isolating your customers. And you're making it clear that some opinions aren't welcome here." The words stung, each one cutting through her defenses. She had thought she was doing what was best for her shop, but now it felt like everything she had believed in was crumbling. The more she tried to justify her actions, the more it felt like she was only digging a deeper hole. The truth was undeniable now, and the weight of it was suffocating. "You can't just pick and choose who gets to be here based on what they wear, Karen," he continued. "Everyone deserves respect, no matter where they stand politically. That's the bottom line." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but she found herself at a loss for words. She had nothing left to say. She had no defense for her actions, no way to spin this in a way that made her seem justified. She had been wrong. There's no denying it anymore. "I'm not asking for an apology, Karen," he said, sensing her internal struggle. "I'm just asking you to think about what you've done. Think about how you've treated people, and think about how you want to run your business moving forward." The words hung in the air like a weight, heavy with meaning. Karen stood there, staring at the man, unable to form a coherent thought. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like she had just been laid bare in front of everyone. There was nothing left to hide behind. No excuses, no rationalizations. And then, just as she thought she might suffocate under the pressure, the door opened again. Another customer stepped in. The moment was broken. The man turned to leave, giving her one last look. "I hope you'll think about what I said," he added, his voice softer now, almost kind. "It's never too late to do better." Karen didn't respond. She simply stood there, watching as he walked out the door, the silence of the cafe swallowing up the last remnants of the conversation. Her mind was racing. What had just happened? What had she done? And now, as the minutes ticked by, it was clear to her. She had lost control, and now she had to face the consequences. The minutes dragged on, but Karen remained rooted to the spot behind the counter, her thoughts swirling in confusion. The man's words echoed in her mind, each one sinking deeper into her consciousness. People don't deserve to be treated like that because of their political views or the clothes they wear. Her gut twisted at the thought. She had never considered her actions in such a way, never understood the full weight of what she had done. But more than that, the unease in her chest was becoming overwhelming. There was no easy way to fix what had just happened. She couldn't take back the words she had spoken or the way she had treated him. All she had left was this awful feeling of regret, combined with a stubbornness that refused to let go of the idea that she had done what she thought was right. The door jangled again, and Karen snapped out of her trance, her heart still beating too fast. A new customer had entered, and she automatically assumed it was just another patron coming to enjoy their coffee. However, as the man stepped into view, something caught her off guard. There he was again, the same man, the one she had kicked out earlier. This time, however, it was different. This time, the man was no longer a stranger. Karen's gaze narrowed, her pulse quickening as she watched him approach the counter with a deliberate, calm stride. He didn't look angry. He didn't look vengeful. He looked composed, like he had a plan. A sense of authority radiated from him that Karen hadn't noticed before, and her stomach dropped. She opened her mouth, intending to say something, but before she could, the man spoke again, and this time it was different. "Karen," he began, his voice steady and firm, "I hope we can have a conversation now." Her breath hitched in her chest. "Weren't we just talking?" she said, her voice coming out sharper than she intended. The man didn't flinch. He simply looked at her, his gaze unwavering, his expression still calm. "I'd like to tell you who I am, if you're willing to listen," he replied evenly. For the first time in what felt like hours, Karen hesitated. This wasn't the man she had kicked out earlier, standing before her now. There was something different about him. He wasn't angry, he wasn't yelling, and he wasn't threatening her. He was simply asking for an audience, a chance to speak. "I think you already know who I am," the man continued. "But I'll tell you anyway." He leaned in just slightly, the air between them thick with tension. "I'm the police chief of this town." Karen's breath caught in her throat. She felt her knees weaken, and for a second she thought she might fall. The police chief. She stared at him, unable to comprehend the words he had just said. She had no idea what to say. She had been so sure of herself when she threw him out, so convinced that she was right in making a statement about his shirt, his beliefs. But now, all that confidence had evaporated, leaving only a crushing sense of guilt and disbelief. I didn't know," Karen said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. She could feel her face burning with shame, her mouth dry, unable to form a coherent thought. "I didn't realize." The police chief simply nodded, his gaze never wavering. "That's the problem, Karen. People make judgments based on things they don't understand, and it leads to situations like this. You treated me like an outsider, like a threat, all because of the way I was dressed. But it's not just about my shirt. It's about respect. And you didn't show me any." Karen didn't know how to respond. Every instinct in her told her to defend herself, to argue that she had done nothing wrong, that she was just standing her ground. But the words wouldn't come. She couldn't deny what he was saying. The truth of his words hit her like a slap to the face. She had misjudged him, and now not only had she humiliated him, but she had also humiliated herself. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. She felt the eyes of the customers on her, some of them looking at her with quiet judgment, some with curiosity, but all of them aware of the shift that had just occurred. She had lost the battle. "I'm not here to make you feel bad, Karen," the police chief said gently, though his words still held a weight of authority. "I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen again. You made a mistake, but we all do. I just hope you can learn from it." Karen's heart raced in her chest as she absorbed his words. He wasn't angry. He wasn't demanding an apology. He was offering her a lesson in humility and understanding. And it was far worse than any punishment he could have given her. The quiet power in his tone, the simple fact that he was willing to give her the chance to learn from her mistake, that was the most humbling thing of all. I didn't mean to hurt you," she finally managed to say, her voice shaky. "I didn't realize." He cut her off before she could finish. "No one's perfect, Karen," he said. "But you need to understand that you can't make judgments like that. Not in this town. Not in this cafe. Not when people are looking to you for leadership." The words hit her hard. She had always thought of herself as a leader, as someone who could make the tough calls, steer the ship. But now, in the face of the police chief's calm words, she realized just how far off the mark she had been. "I'll take this as a lesson," she whispered, her eyes finally meeting his. "I'm sorry. I should never have treated you that way." The police chief nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "You'll learn. I'm sure of it. But this won't be the last time I'm in here, Karen. So I hope you can make things right, starting with yourself." Karen nodded, unable to speak further. Her chest tightened as the weight of his words continued to press on her. The air felt heavy, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. With one last look, the police chief turned and walked toward the door. As the door swung open and the bell rang, Karen finally exhaled, the tension in her body unraveling. But there was no relief. No moment of redemption. The lesson had been delivered, and the consequences had been made clear. Karen stood there, her hands gripping the counter as she tried to steady her breathing. The door had barely closed behind the police chief when the full weight of what had just happened crashed down on her. It felt like the entire room had shifted. For the first time in a long while, she was unsure of herself, unsure of what was to come next. The customers in the cafe, who had been silently observing the entire confrontation, now seemed to return to their conversations, albeit more quietly than before. The subtle shift in energy was palpable. No one was talking about the situation openly, but everyone knew what had just transpired. Emma, standing behind the counter, watched Karen closely, sensing the turbulence in the air. She had seen her boss in many moods before, but this was something different. Karen stood motionless for a few more seconds, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. The police chief's words reverberated in her head, cutting deeper with every moment that passed. "You treated me like an outsider, but it's not just about my shirt. It's about respect." It was like a mantra now, echoing in her mind, making her feel more exposed with each repetition. Karen had always been quick to judge others, to draw hard lines about what was acceptable and what wasn't. She prided herself on being a woman of conviction, on having clear, defined beliefs. But now she wondered if that rigidity had been her downfall. Was she so set in her views that she had lost sight of the bigger picture? Had she truly become the kind of person who would judge someone by their appearance without considering who they were beneath it? Emma hesitated, watching Karen with uncertainty. She had never seen her boss so defeated. Karen had been strong, almost untouchable in her authority, but now she was a shell of that person. Emma had learned to keep her distance over the years, knowing that Karen didn't often like to show weakness, but something in her couldn't help but feel concerned. She approached the counter slowly, unsure if Karen would even acknowledge her presence. Karen's gaze slowly lifted, meeting Emma's eyes for the first time since the confrontation. There was a rawness in her expression that Emma wasn't used to seeing. The walls Karen had always kept up were starting to crumble. "Emma," Karen's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I've made a mistake. A huge one." Emma didn't speak right away, choosing instead to simply nod. She had no idea what to say to ease the tension. The last thing she wanted was to make Karen feel even worse, but the woman's honesty caught her off guard. It was rare to see Karen show vulnerability. I shouldn't have kicked him out. I shouldn't have treated him that way," Karen continued, her voice shaking slightly now. "I've always prided myself on running this place with my own rules, but I've let that pride cloud my judgment." Emma stayed silent, watching as Karen seemed to process the events in real time. She could feel the weight of Karen's words, the regret that was heavy in the air. Karen wasn't someone who apologized often, and the sincerity of this moment wasn't lost on Emma. "I've let my own biases control how I treat people," Karen admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And today, I lost sight of what's important." I was wrong." For a moment, Emma just stood there, unsure of how to respond. What could she say? What was there to say that would make any of this better? But then Karen looked at her, and there was something in her eyes, an openness, a rawness, that Emma hadn't seen before. "You've learned something today," Emma said quietly, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes the hardest thing to do is admit when we're wrong. But it's the only way forward." Karen let out a shaky breath, the guilt in her eyes obvious, but there was something else there too. She was looking at Emma now with a sense of vulnerability, and for the first time, Emma saw the cracks in her boss's armor. "I know I have to make things right," Karen said, her voice steadier now. "I can't let this happen again. I don't want to lose the respect of my customers. I don't want to become someone who people dread walking into this place." Emma nodded. "It won't be easy, but you've already started by recognizing it. That's the first step." Karen stood up straighter now, her eyes focused ahead. She seemed to gather her strength, standing a little taller, but there was still an unmistakable tension in her posture. She wasn't sure how she would make it right, how she could fix the damage she had caused, but at least now she was aware of the need to change. The road ahead wouldn't be simple, but she knew it had to start with an acknowledgement of her mistakes. As the day went on, Karen found herself lost in thought. The cafe bustled with activity, and the usual customers came and went, but Karen couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do next, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't just go back to business as usual. She had to do something more. It wasn't long before she made a decision. The police chief had been right, she realized. It wasn't about the shirt. It wasn't about his political affiliation. It was about how she had treated him, and how she had treated others in her life who didn't fit into the neat little box she had constructed for herself. Her business, her cafe, wasn't just about making money. It was about creating a space where everyone felt welcome, regardless of their beliefs, their opinions, or their appearance. The next morning, Karen sat down at the cafe's counter with a notebook in hand. She began to sketch out a new plan, one that would focus on inclusivity, on creating a welcoming environment for everyone who walked through the door. She wasn't going to be perfect, but she would try. She would take the lesson she had learned, the one that had been forced upon her, and build something better from it. As the days passed, things began to change. Karen approached her customers with a new mindset, a willingness to listen, to understand. And as for the police chief, well, he never came back. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Karen had learned how to be a better person, a better leader, and someone who could look beyond surface judgments to see the value in every individual. The road ahead was long, but it was the only one she wanted to walk.